I mean, don't do it if it's going to muck up your computer.
No. It's just a matter of whether it'll be very feasible to share it very easily. But yeah, okay, we started it, and we'll.
I'm just assuming that nobody at the meeting objects to it being recorded. I hope not.
We will let everyone know. So, well, why don't we get started? So,
actually, could I give a little
yeah, David, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, well, thank you all for coming to this Trail Trekker event. I wish I could hand out sign-up sheets and make sure you all sign up, but I can't. I don't have to give my usual warning about not falling down. So I guess I'll just say, really, thanks a lot for coming. How did you all hear about it? From our email?
Yes.
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 Okay, that seems to be the answer. I will now turn it over to our hike leader, David.
Thanks, David. My name is David Ackerley, and there's a couple familiar faces on the screen and or familiar names. And it's nice to see you all. And I'm sorry we're not out on the open space together. It's a lovely day. The nice thing is that all of us individually can go out and enjoy these walks, just not as a group. So actually, what I'll do here is we'll I'll do this virtual hike. You'll see, it's as if we're walking the trails and looking at the trees in the order we would see them. And then, of course, you can go do the walk yourself, and maybe you'll pick up a couple new things and enjoy it. I just want to preface by saying, I know there's people here who know a lot about these trees. So there'll be a lot here, which is very familiar. I'm not, and some people, I hope there's a little bit new for everyone. And if nothing else, it's just a nice way to spend a little time together. Before we start,
you want bacon?
The best thing to do here is for everyone to mute their audio. So in the lower left of your Zoom screen, there's a button that says mute. And if you mute, now I can also mute you, but it's a great thing to be doing yourself. There we go. Let's see a couple, and then this is a small group, so we're probably fine. But if you, there's a couple people who haven't muted. I'm going to go ahead and do it myself because I have the control. That's the control. You're all muted, so if you're trying to talk to the group, you won't be heard unless you unmute. Now there's also in the bottom of your screen, and again, some of you are probably spending all day like I am on Zoom, and some of you may be hopefully not spending your whole life on it. So just a couple quick, the quick pro tips that we're all learning. There should be a control panel at the bottom of your screen with different features, and one of them says chat. And if you click on chat, it opens up a window on the right side. If your window's open and you click on it, that window will close. So the chat, you can open and close it. And in that chat, you can actually drop questions and comments anytime as we're talking. And you can also actually answer each other. So one thing we're finding in classes and in meetings is there's these little quiet conversations that kind of go on the side while people are talking, and someone can pose a question and someone else can answer it. You can also, if you just really like to jump in and ask a question with audio, you can put in the chat, can I ask a question, and I'll see it, and then I can look for a pause as I'm talking, like between a couple slides, and then stop and take questions by audio. So those are the basic those are kind of the basics of Zoom. And Wade Huntley is very kindly monitoring the chat, and if you actually have technical problems and you put them in the chat, he can jump in and answer you in case I missed that, and we keep going. So hopefully that all works. And what I'm going to now do is, oh, and the other thing is you can also turn off your video so your face doesn't project. It looks like there's no problem with it, but in large groups, what we find is that the bandwidth from all the video, especially if you have, it's actually best if people click that stop video if you see it on your screen. The reason is that for people who have a slow bandwidth, the video becomes just part of the load, and it can be hard to receive like the slides and stuff when it's also feeding all the video. So, and I'll just keep mine on because if you have me up, it can be nice to see someone's face speaking, but you don't have to. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, and you should now see, now I just have to do one little adjustment here. Oh, I thought I had this all figured out. One adjustment to bring the chat window back up where I can see it. There we go. So you should now all see a picture of the El Cerrito open space, the entrance to the main trail, and pop into the chat or chat if you can't see it, or let us know. So we've done this hike once before. It's possible even a couple of you might have been on it, and it will be a lot of the same walk. I expect a lot of you have done this walk before as well, and it will be all familiar. And really my intent here, I'm a ecologist. I teach at UC Berkeley. I moved to El Cerrito about 2 years ago and started walking my dog in the Hillside open space, and also now I live closer to Canyon Trail Park, and I go there almost every day in our shelter in place. And I have to say, as much as I like to go out and walk in the parks, I've actually walked them a little bit more often and a little bit more thoughtfully, and I've taken my camera with me, and I've really frankly enjoyed the focus on our local neighborhood during the shelter in place, and just paid a little bit more attention to all the trees and the birds around me. A friend and I have a bird watching competition of who can see more species with your feet on your property, even if you're looking out with your binoculars. I'm up to 21, and she's in Oakland, and she's up to 23. So it's creeping along, and it just gives something to do every day. Bird watching is actually getting some attention. It's even been it's been in the New York Times as an activity that's getting renewed attention from people looking for ways to spend their time in this moment. I'm not going to say anything about the history. The Trekkers website has some information, and there's people out there who know much more than I do. In fact, someday I would love to sit down and learn more about the history of the open space, the Memorial Grove. So I'll just talk about the trees that are there, what I see when I walk around, and talk about what we know about various climate and how climate's changing and how trees may respond to that, about fire and fire ecology, not that we expect a fire in the open space, but that what we learned about fire and forests when we look at these trees. So we're right here in Schmidt Lane, right as you approach the recycling center, the familiar main entrance. And as I go, I'm gonna, now I just advanced my slide, so you should see a second slide. This is an image from Google Earth, just looking down the aerial view. And as I go, I'll drop this image in occasionally just to keep track of where we are. This is, now you also should be able to see my mouse move on the screen. Might be a little delay, so I'll try to move it slowly. The recycling center, the main entrance, Navalier Street that goes all along the west side to almost to Portola on the other end. And we're gonna spend most of the things I'm going to talk about are right in the Grove, right in this first stretch. And if you walk the loop there, that's less than a mile. But then, as you know, there's the trail that goes through the Oak Woodlands and loops back around on the Fire Road, and that gets to just under 2 miles, about the full loop. And there's some other nice things to see up there. And I've just marked some familiar viewpoints. You all know there's multiple points along the trail where you turn and have beautiful views of the city. So zooming into the Memorial Grove, here we are at the entrance with this interesting collection of pine trees we'll talk about in this first little loop. And as I go, each tree I talk about will have a number on the slide, and this shows where they all are, and I'll check in a couple times and show you where we are. So as much as possible, I want to give you the sense that we're actually walking this trail. And then also I'll talk to David, and we'll find a way to have this recording. This is recording right now, and also we can make a PDF out of this slideshow or something. Maybe someday make a little booklet would be kind of fun, because it's such a beautiful sequence and such a nice, diverse area of native and non-native. I've just noticed a mistake. I think I fixed it later. We're actually gonna get to 27 tree species, tree and shrub species. I counted about 16 of them are California natives, and the others are non-natives, and I'll note those as we go along. So going back to the entrance, I think, and all the pictures I took in the last week or two, so everything's about what it looks like right now. Some things were flowering, they're beginning to go by, some things haven't flowered yet. But this is about what it looks like this time of year. So right by the entrance, we have 2 California natives. To the left of the sign, the beautiful yellow flannel bush for Montedendron. Mostly found further south than here, but it makes its way up into the Bay Area. And And I won't pretend to know what, well, I'll talk more about natives in a moment, but as you go, you'll see a little yellow California symbol on the slides, and that means that it is a California native. Now, what's an East Bay native? That's a little trickier, and we can reflect on that as we go along. But the one that's a little less obvious to the right behind the sign, this little green one with some white flowers on it, that's a beautiful Catalina Cherry, and some of you may know this. This is quite an interesting plant because the chaparral cherry, Prunus ilicifolia, is native all through the Coast Ranges, and comes up into the Bay Area. But this is a subspecies that is endemic to the Channel Islands. And what's interesting is the Channel Islands did not have any native herbivores on them. There were no mammals out there that were eating the trees. And what you see in the Channel Island subspecies is the leaves have no teeth on them, and they're a little thinner, whereas the mainland subspecies of the cherry has a thicker leaf with teeth, which defended it against deer and other browsers. So some of these Channel Island plants, I think, are quite popular in horticulture, especially because they're a little less thorny and a little easier to handle, and quite a pretty one. And you'll see this planted all over town. But the native populations come from the Channel Islands. As you start up the path, then you run right into some non-natives, some familiar ones, fire thorns, which are planted all over, do very well in gardens and plantings. And these are one of many Asian, most of our non-native shrubs are either Asian, East Asian to Western Europe, or from other Mediterranean climate regions like South Africa. And actually, I don't think there's any examples on this walk, but in people's gardens, there's lots of South African shrubs that do very well. And these are in the Rosaceae, the five petals in the flower, like a cherry or an apple. That's a really characteristic, that rose type flower. Continuing up this first little stretch, you come across a lemonade berry, 3 or 4 lemonade berries, and Rus integrifolia, it's a California native. And I remember the first time that I walked the open space and saw the lemonade berry and thought, well, this is interesting because they've been there for a while. They're fairly good sized plants, so they were clearly planted some time ago. But they're not, they weren't originally from the East Bay. They're mostly from Santa Barbara South. A few of them mostly in the South Coast. But here's a first example of something I think about a lot, which is, the climate is warming, for better or worse. We don't tend to like it because we're not happy with all the fossil fuels and the greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere. Of course, we're all quite happy when we are able to go places and fly planes and drive cars. So we're all part of the problem and part of the solution as we try to tackle the climate crisis, although that's a little bit less on our minds right now with the COVID crisis. And as it gets warmer, plants that are native to Southern California are likely going to do better and better. And of course, that will be relevant for horticulture and gardening. But increasingly, it's going to be part of how we think about conservation. Maybe something like lemonade berry, which wasn't native to the Bay Area, maybe that's not such a bad thing to include in restoration projects, even if it escapes, even if it becomes wild, because it will do well in a warmer climate. Maybe some of the things that lived here in the past won't do as well. So with the changing, this is what my research is about. I think about it a lot. Do we need to change what we think of as native, and when the climate starts changing, when we want plants that will do well, and would we prefer some other California plants versus plants from other parts of the world? And of course, part of this depends on whether we're in a garden or in a city park or in a managed, restored natural area or in a wilderness area, and we really take different approaches to what plants we might want to see in different places. So there's absolutely no right or wrong answer, but these are the questions that we're thinking about a lot. We think about it in conservation, we think about it with restoration and restoration biologists as they look at different opportunities in different projects. This is looking backwards, but as you keep up the walk, there's actually a little incense cedar planted off to the left. There's a couple others in the open space, and these are mostly in the Sierra. They get into the Mendocino Highlands, and they come down, and they're sort of scattered through some of the coast ranges, but not very common at all along the coast, much more in the mountains. But they do quite well. They do well in the warm climates of the Sierra foothills, and do well in the Bay Area. And they're beautiful little one. And this one you can barely see, but at the bottom, this is a planting, I presume, by the city tree department, the parks department. You can see that it's got some padding around the base to help it get started as they pick things. And again, I've been in touch a little bit with Stephen Prey, one of the arborists, or the main arborist for El Cerrito. I'd love to spend more time with him and just learn more about how he thinks about all the city trees and what the future, what kinds of things they choose to put into the parks. And this is, of course, a conifer with very scaly, needly leaves. You can see a real flat spray of needles. Then right across the path from there, you run into the first two coast live oak. So familiar species probably to everyone. Native from kind of Sonoma, northern Sonoma, all the way to northern Baja, right down the coast ranges. Doesn't go to the Sierra at all. By far the most common tree in the Hillside open area, by most common tree in most Bay Area parks and woodlands. The acorns germinate readily. Some oaks are having trouble regenerating in California, but coast live oak seems to do very, very well. It has been threatened by sudden oak death, so we do see some mortality, and we see some mortality during the drought events. But it's all over, and many of you will probably know this. The distinguishing character to get to know is you turn the leaf over and look at it closely, and what you see are these the hairy armpits, as people say, a little bit of fuzz right in that, in the first couple of veins. And you won't find it on every leaf, but check for a few and look for it. If you don't find it at all, if you find a really, really smooth underside of the leaf, especially as you move away from the coast, then you can be getting into some other oaks, interior live oak and others. And there's 17 oak species in California. This is part of my research is on oaks. And coast live is the most common in this area. But even the specialists struggle to identify some of them. They hybridize, and there's all sorts of natural variation within each species. So it can take some expertise to learn to identify all of our oaks, but the coast live is usually the first one that is easy to pick up on. Now, right at the corner, one of my favorite Bay Area plants, silk tassel, the genus Garrya, and it's flowering right now. Let me go back on the oak. Wade just saying, is oak death abating? No, sorry, I didn't mean to imply that. No, I'm saying that coast live is susceptible to sudden oak death. It's not all oaks are susceptible, but it is. The sudden oak death definitely spreads more in wet years than dry years, so we don't know how a warming climate may affect it. But you get less of it as you move away from the coast when it gets hotter and drier. So there are some limits to spread to the interior, but it's still continuing to spread up and down the coast. Right now, it's more spreading north still along the Northern California coast. And I'm not a plant pathologist by any means. I can recognize, when I see a really obvious dead one, but I'm not very good at picking up on the signs of how much it's spreading in these areas. Going back to silk tassel, Garrya, one of my favorite Bay Area plants, one of the favorites just because it's just a little uncommon. So whenever you find it, it just feels kind of special. You're hiking a Mount Tam or Briones, and you'll come across just one or two here and there. And most of the year, it's very nondescript. And these leaves, you might walk by and think it was a coast live oak or some other shrub. Doesn't draw your attention. And then in spring when it flowers, it's completely distinctive. These are 6-8-inch long catkins full of open flowers. And almost every time you see a catkin, something long and dangly like this, that's a sign that it's wind pollinated. So they're dangling out in the wind, and the wind can pick up the pollen. Of course, a lot of plants don't obey. They don't follow some strict rule. They may have pollen distributed by the wind. They might also have insects that land on the flowers and pick up pollen and carry it plant to plant. So, plants aren't all one or all the other. But I also want to point out, for those of you who know your tree ID, you know that one of the first things to look at when you're identifying trees and shrubs is whether the leaves, here's the base of the leaf and the base of the leaf in the Garrya, and here's the twig, are the leaves coming out of opposite each other, which means there's a node. A node is what we call the point where a leaf attaches to a twig. If you have a node that has leaves coming out on either side, we call those opposite leaves. If they come out alternating, we call it appropriately alternate leaves. And opposite leaves are much less common. I have no deep evolutionary explanation for that. There's actually some interesting things to talk about how leaves are displayed and how they capture light. But as a diagnostic key, when you see opposite, it narrows the list of characters very quickly. And I'll point out to you one or two others as we do this wall. So that's a quick key when you see the Garrya that distinguishes it from the oaks. And then finally, as we come to the top of this first stretch, we come to the first toyon, or Heteromeles arbuifolia, our very widespread, very common California native shrub. A nice evergreen leaf. And actually it's hard to see here, but alternate. So unlike that Garrya, here's an example where they come off alternate. You'll find them in openings, you'll find them under eucalyptus, you'll find them under redwoods, incredibly broad ecological range, different soils, maybe 20, 30 feet tall when you find a really old big one, much smaller when they're out in the sun. And one of the distinguishing characters is a bright red berry, and there's only a couple other things with bright red berries, mostly non-natives. And that berry ripens at the end of the year. So toyon doesn't flower, hasn't started to flower yet, won't be till maybe June, early summer, or even midsummer. And then the berries ripen and turn red in the fall. And that has given it one of its other common names, which is Christmas berry. So because these turn bright red as you approach the holidays. Now the other really interesting common name, and this has both a cultural story and a ecological story, they're also called Hollywood. It is in fact the case, I've been told, that the hillsides on the north side of the LA basin had a lot of chaparral, and chaparral is the name we give to the general evergreen shrubland in California, with lots of toyon or Hollywood. And in fact, the name Hollywood, the studios, was named for the fact that this plant was common on those hills, and may still be common. I haven't spent much time down there, but probably less common since LA has been developed. But the other thing to note there is that the name Hollywood has the word holly in it. Hollies are European plants, and they're escaped here. I know there's a nice one in Canyon Trail Park. I haven't seen it in the Hillside open space. And hollies, which are common in Spain and Iberian Peninsula, were familiar to the Spaniards when they came to California. And they saw a lot of plants with similar leaves. And what's similar about them is that they have evolved in a similar climate. So Spain and France also have a very hot summer, rainy winter, what we call the Mediterranean type climate, because that's what it's like in the Mediterranean basin. California has a Mediterranean type climate. So does Chile, so does South Africa, and so do Australia. These are the 5 regions. And this climate selects for plants that have very tough leaves to survive the summer dry season. Rains all winter, the soils fill up with water. Some of these plants have quite deep roots. Toyon, intermediate, the roots might go down 1 or 2 meters. Some of the oaks go down 5 meters, even more. And then they tap into that water during the summer, and they keep growing. Even, just thinking about the fact that our native plants keep growing all summer, many of them without a drop of rain, is quite extraordinary. So they have a great capacity to tap into soil water and then use it very conservatively. And these tough evergreen leaves are part of that conservative, tough drought tolerant strategy. And the botanical term for this tough evergreen leaf is a sclerophyll, and that is Greek for a leathery leaf. So like scleros, like sclerotic, means leathery or tough. And these are sclerophyll leaves. But hollies have sclerophyll leaves. So when the Spanish came, they called a lot of things hollies because it looked like they're plants from home, but they were all these unfamiliar California plants. And in fact, we have several plants, including that Catalina Cherry that I showed you, where the scientific name means holly leaf, even though it's not a holly at all. So little tidbit about Hollywood and Christmasberry, or toyon, which is the Spanish name for Heteromeles. It's California native. There's only 1 species in this genus. It doesn't really have any close relatives, and it's found all across the California region. So we've just walked from the entrance here. All we've done is just the first little path to the first entrance. I think we've gone about 30 yards. That toyon sits right there. And now we're going to head up into the pine grove and look at mostly conifers, this group up to number 15, or up to 15. So you turn and you look up and you see the lovely pine grove. And one thing that can catch your eye here, if you scan from tree to tree, you see that the colors are changing and the length of the needles is changing and how dense the needles are is changing, because there's actually 4 or 5 pine species that have been planted into this grove. And it's a nice little display of some pine diversity. Pines are very, very diverse. 100 to 200 species, many species in Mexico, all across the Western US, across Asia. So this is just a tiny sampling of native and non-native. There's quite a few redwoods in the natural area, and mostly on the small side. Excuse me for one moment. I have to, oh no, I'm okay, I'm sorry. I have a dog scratching at my door. I'm sorry, I thought she was trying to get out. She's trying to get in. In Canyon Trail, there's some nice big redwoods. I don't know how long they've been there. They can grow quite quickly. These are not so big, so obviously not planted too long ago. And you know, redwoods can grow fast. They can handle the high light. Some of the redwoods in the natural area are looking a little scraggly though, and it might just be a little too hot and dry. You know, redwoods love fog, and that's what really keeps them hugging the coast. And the fog is key to how they take up water. They actually capture water out of fog onto the upper needles, and they can use it for that water for photosynthesis, and they don't have to rely only on the water that they bring up from the soil. So that's a whole fascinating area of redwood ecology, is how they trap fog and use it, and they also trap it and it drips down to the ground. And as you all know, when you go walking in redwood forests, you have all that water. A lot of that water is being captured from the fog and really bringing extra water into those ecosystems. Michelle, a perfect, you know exactly where we're headed about longleaf pines. The next one you see as you come up the trail is 2 beautiful Canary Island pines, Pinus canariensis. So you can see from my hand there, it's a fairly long needle, and there's a couple others. The only thing I'll say officially is I don't think any of us can officially sanction collecting needles out of the city park. You could talk to the city folks about that, or maybe freshly dropped ones on the ground. But yes, there is a beautiful long needle pine there. And as it says, this is from the Canary Islands in the Atlantic, which also are Mediterranean climate. So it's quite dry in summer out in the islands. So the Canary Islands also have quite a few plants with well adapted to summer drought, and they grow well when we bring them into our ecosystems. And this is the male cones, which is a kind of a slightly sloppy term botanically, but intuitive. So these are pollen producing cones that are just beginning to ripen. A lot of pines will have produced the pollen separately on a pollen producing cone, and then an ovulate cone that receives the pollen and then produces the big cone that we see with the seeds. And these are all, looks like they're about to start releasing. Actually, a little hard to tell if they're just gone by or just about to release. Of course, pine pollen can blow in the wind for hundreds of miles. It can be a terrible source of asthma for some people, and it can accumulate. You see these yellow pools of pollen sometimes on the surface of the water, and sometimes that's come from a huge distance away as it blows on the wind. When you turn to the right, as you're walking up the path, a whole lot of the trees in the collection are the Afghan pine, Pinus elderica. I know very little about this species. What I know, I mostly learned from Wikipedia, frankly, when I first started looking a year ago when we did this hike. But it does turn out it's fairly widely used. Like, it comes up in Texas, like when you Google it, about widely used as a shade tree or a windbreak in dry parts of Texas. I presume it's fairly drought adapted from Central Asia, but I'm not familiar with it in other parts of California. But it has a kind of reddish bark, short needles, small cones, and once you pick up on the set of characters, you'll see that quite a few of the trees in the grove are Afghan pines. Right next to that Afghan pine is the first Monterey Cypress that you'll see. There's quite a few scattered around the area. So another California native from the Central Coast. And very distinctive, these long pointed branches, very small cypress needles, so quite different from the pines. So it's a conifer, it's a needle leaf plant. It's not a pine in the sense that it's not in the genus pine, or the pine family. part of the cypress family more broadly. And here you see something really interesting. Look at all those cones, and and if you go up close to a cypress cone, you'll see it's a tightly packed little, just like a little ball that doesn't seem to have any way for a seed to get out. So Monterey cypress is part of a group of plants that we call the closed cone conifers. And closed cone conifers produce lots of cones year after year, and they hold them very tightly. And then they sit on the tree, and the heat of a fire is what cracks them open. And this is a phenomenon that botanists call serotiny. I'm actually going to type it in the chat because it's always a hard word to see if you've never seen it. So serotiny is the botanical term for a tree that makes cones full of, or fruits. There's other plants that are not conifers, fruits. They're tightly packed and they're closed, and then they crack open from heat, sometimes smoke, but more often heat. And so these seeds only disperse in the moment when a fire has occurred, and then they germinate and establish and recruit in the post-fire environment. And when you see serotiny, it's one of the indications that you're looking at a tree that has adapted to fire in its evolutionary history, because it's a very particular set of adaptations. And we see it in quite a few other conifers. Also in Australia and in South Africa, lots of flowering plants, so not the needle leaf plants, but the flowering plants are also serotinous. And for reasons that no one really knows, all of the serotinous plants in the Northern Hemisphere they're only found in the conifers, mostly cypresses and pines. And we'll see, so here's another important example of oh, no, I gotta skip one and then I'll come back. One little note, while we're in the pine grove, a non-conifer, there's one nice little manzanita planted underneath that Monterey cypress, just on the right as you walk up. A lot of you will know manzanitas. I'm sure you all know them. The red bark, closely related to madrones, which also has the beautiful red bark. A very tough leaf, oriented vertically, so when the sun hits the leaf at midday, it doesn't shine too brightly on either side. And actually both sides, there's no upper or lower side physiologically on a manzanita leaf. These vertical ones can have the sun hit from either side and be equally efficient for photosynthesis. Also very well adapted to fire. So either resprouting after fires, or sometimes not resprouting, but having seeds that they've dropped into the soil that are sitting there and are triggered only when the fire occurs. And that's when they germinate and establish. So you kind of have two sets of fire adaptations. Now we get to another one, the Coulter Pine. So the Coulter Pine, like the cypress, produces seeds, stores them in the canopy, and then they are released when there's a fire. The manzanita, as well as ceanothus, the other shrub that we don't see here, the California lilac, common name, not a lilac. But ceanothus and manzanita are shrubs that produce seeds that drop into the soil, and they're stored in the soil and germinate after a fire. But the pines, some of these pines and cypresses produce seeds, but store them in the canopy. So they both are adapted to fire, but they store the seeds in a different place until the next fire comes along. There's a nice little collection, 3 or 4 or 5 Coulter pines here in the grove. Also very long needle. These two are looking a little thin and scraggly. Not sure how well they're doing. There's one around the corner that looks a little better. There's actually one that I think has died. And then you look up and you see these big cones. It's hard to get the scale here. But Coulter pine has the largest cone of any pine in the world, actually, the heaviest cone, not the longest. The longest is the sugar pine in the Sierra. The heaviest is the Coulter pine. And literally, you will hear the stories of people having their windshield cracked if you park under a Coulter pine and these fruits drop off. So Wade, yeah, good question about pine trees reproducing without fire. So it varies. Some of these cones, if they sit on the tree long enough and they heat up, just the heat of multiple summers will eventually crack them open. Like gray pine, which is another relative of Coulter pine, which we don't see in the open space, but it's native around the area. So some will release after a few years, some much less. So it's a good question. I don't I don't know if any of these species would literally die out in the absence of a fire, but in these parks, you know, in the open space, we're probably not going to rely on natural regeneration quite as much, you know, as opposed to being able to plant them when we need more. But we could certainly see if there's a long time without fire, or if fires are coming too frequently, you can see some species drop out and others come in different places. Can you tell from the accumulation how long the last fire was? Well, the general rule is that these trees actually die in the fires. So with Bishop Pine, which is the one out on Point Reyes, which is a closed cone pine, and Coulter Pine and Gray Pine, the time since the last fire might be the age of the tree itself. So not so much telling from the cones, but even just looking at how big the trees are. So anyone who's been driving the Vision Road for the last 20 years on Point Reyes, watching the Mountain Vision Road, or the Limantour Road, sorry, watching the recovery from the Vision fire, there was just that, they call it a dog hair stand of just little Bishop pines that came up really closely packed, and now they're beginning to die off. Some of them, the small ones, die off. Some are getting bigger, and those big ones are going to take over. And so in a sense, you can see how long it's been since that fire by watching that stand develop as the big Bishop pine come back. And any of you who've been spending time in Sonoma before the shelter in place and visiting any of the parks that burned, you know, it's been a real lesson and opportunity to see what it looks like. I worked in Sonoma, and watching the post-fire recovery, that's a whole different talk, but it's been fascinating to watch these forests recover after the fires in the North Bay. There's a couple stone pine in the open space. This is one just where we're getting near the top. And I just threw this picture in. It's the only picture I put in that I didn't take in the open space. I found this on Google, just as maybe a familiar image, that stone pine is one that can make a really wide, broad canopy. So it's often used in city settings where you have a pine that grows out very wide, and you see native pictures like this in Europe. They're not taking on that form here in the hillside because they're pretty close to some other trees, so they don't have a lot of room to spread out. And that brings us, so we've now come up this trail all the way up through the pines. That was the stone pine right there. That's one of them. I think there's another back there. And I think Stephen Prey sent me some of the template so I could learn these trees, because it was not obvious the first times I walked through, picking out all the one from another and knowing which ones would be there of all the possible pines. So I can't claim that I walked into this grove and learned to identify all these from directly from the tree. Definitely had a little help. And then that brings us to a very familiar spot, which is the first big beautiful viewpoint, looking out over the bay and out to the Golden Gate Bridge. And of course, it's a view you get over and over as you walk around on these trails. Just a couple quick notes, and then I think I'm going to follow a tip from Wade to stop the recording and start a new one, only because it helps the files be a little stronger, a little smaller. A lot of the trees we're looking at occur in multiple places, and all I'm doing is showing you one and showing you where I took the pictures of it. So of course, the trick is once you begin to learn them, then the next time you see it, you know, it's familiar and you recognize it. So I'm just showing you more or less kind of the first one that you see along most of these walks, not always the first one, maybe just a place where it's really easy to look at it and you get a really good look at it, and then you can begin to get familiar and then see them in other places as you walk around and continue your hike. Right here by this is this view. When you turn around, there's actually a lovely little elderberry shrub. It's just started flowering. It's sitting under another cypress right there, right by the trail. And I just want to draw your attention that elderberry is another opposite leaf. So here you see the leaves coming out right across from each other at one node. It's also a compound leaf, and a compound leaf means you go up the leaf stem and you have leaflets. So rather than having one blade, you have multiple blades. So you can see all the multiple blades here that are part of one leaf. So you have alternate leaves and opposite leaves, and then you have simple leaves like an oak and compound leaves like an elderberry. And that combination is how some field guides are organized: alternate simple, alternate compound, opposite compound. And opposite compound is even less common than opposite simple. So elderberry is one of the few in our native flora that's an opposite compound leaf. And that's a quick guide when you come across these. There's two species and you tell them apart by learning about the shape of the flowers, or when they fruit, the black refers to the color of the fruit. Some are black or blue or red. So pretty little elderberry right there. And then you turn your head up and of course you see our very familiar but not native, one of many eucalyptus, but the one that's most common in the Bay Area, the blue gum. Urabi, I guess, is an Australian name for it, not one I hear people using around here. And now we see another story in fire ecology. Eucalypts burn very hot. This is not news to anyone in the Bay Area, anyone who lived through the Oakland Hills fire, but it's part of their natural ecology in Australia. Like the pines, like the manzanitas, they live in a place where they are adapted to frequent fire. They resprout vigorously. The crowns re-green up. And I'm not an expert on eucalypt fire ecology, but this stripping bark feeds the fires, but the plants also recover from the fires. But of course, it contributes to fire risk in our neighborhoods. And I know there's been a lot of attention to the eucalypt removal up on the hill, up behind Berkeley and stuff, which is very much aimed at reducing fire risk. Certainly for some people, it's been upsetting to see big trees come down. Over time, we'll have other trees there, maybe replace them with oaks and recover the forest. But you can't make that kind of change without having it look a little raw in the interim during the operations. So something that has certainly gotten a lot of attention. Eucalypt also have a couple other, one thing that there's a couple flowering right now, these pretty white flowers up in the canopy when you get a look at those. And the other thing many of you may know, but if you don't, it's neat to look out for. This is the eucalypt leaf, the familiar leaf when you look up in the canopy. But then you'll see these little seedlings around with this pale blue wide leaf, and you go, oh, what species is that? That turns out to be a baby eucalyptus. So eucalypts are one of the small number of species that actually have a very different leaf form in the juvenile and the adult. And then you'll pick up a medium-sized plants and you see both forms on the same plant and you realize it's the same thing. That's a baby eucalypt up there. Right near the eucalypt, another familiar plant, of course, keep your eyes out. There's poison oak in the hillside open space, so don't go grabbing every plant you see and identifying it. A compound leaf, 3 leaflets, leaves of 3, let it be, the saying for poison oak. Often a lot of reddish in fall especially, or new leaves are red, in fall it's red, the twigs can be a little reddish. And you see it's an alternate compound, so the leaves are coming out left, right, left, right. So alternate on the node, compound leaf, and right now some flowers and fruits. And it's a beautiful plant. It's just hard to look at it and appreciate its beauty sometimes, because as soon as we see it, we throw up a little warning that we don't want to touch it. But they really are quite pretty, especially when they're flowering. And then you come to a fork, and if you go left, you come to the next beautiful view, and that bench with the Golden Gate Bridge view. Now let me pause, and if I can, I'm going to stop recording